In pre-modern cities, death created an immediate problem. The body occupied living space. It could not remain there for long. It had to be moved, documented, and placed somewhere approved, often within a single day. There were no funeral homes to contact, no standardized services to manage the process, no single profession responsible for what happened next. Instead, cities relied on a loose system of households, religious authorities, laborers, and municipal officials to move the dead out of daily life and into designated spaces. This was not primarily a ceremonial process. It was a logistical one. Bodies needed to be cleared from crowded homes. Streets needed to remain usable. Burial grounds needed to be managed within limited space. This video examines what cities did with the dead before modern funeral services existed. The focus is on urban areas from roughly the medieval period through the early 19th century. We are not looking at beliefs about the afterlife. We are looking at procedures, how bodies were handled immediately after death, who was responsible for each step, how the dead were prepared, transported, recorded, and buried under practical constraints. Because long before death became a service, it was an administrative task. In pre-modern cities, most people died at home. Medical institutions existed, but they were limited. Hospitals functioned more as charitable shelters than treatment centers. Death also occurred in workshops, inns, boarding houses, and communal residences. Urban density meant that people lived and worked in close quarters. Private space was limited. A single room might serve as a bedroom, kitchen, and workplace. When someone died, the body usually remained where death occurred, at least temporarily. There were no dedicated facilities for immediate removal. This created pressure. Living spaces had to be returned to use quickly. Neighbors and family members were often still present. The longer a body remained, the more disruptive it became. The first steps after death were handled locally. Family members or nearby residents closed the eyes and arranged the body. Basic washing might occur, depending on custom and availability of water. The body was typically wrapped in cloth or a simple shroud. Among poorer households, this might be reused fabric. Coffins were not universal. Many people were buried without them, especially in earlier periods or during times of scarcity. Cooling options were limited. In warm weather, decomposition progressed quickly. Because of this, burial often occurred within 24 hours. In colder months, slightly longer delays were possible. There was little expectation of prolonged viewing or preservation. Responsibility for the dead was divided. Households handled immediate care. Religious institutions oversaw burial rites and access to burial grounds. Municipal authorities regulated timing, location, and fees. Their concern was order, not ceremony. Specific workers handled physical labor. These included gravediggers, porters, and body bearers. In some cities, these roles were formalized. In others, they were temporary or informal. There was no single coordinator. The process relied on custom, expectation, and local knowledge. Preparation of the body was minimal by modern standards. Washing was brief. Shrouding was simple. Embalming was rare and limited to elites in certain periods. Most bodies were buried in a natural state. Clothing was functional rather than decorative. Special burial garments existed but were not common. Preparation took place in the home or, occasionally, in religious buildings. There were no specialized rooms or equipment. Time, space, and labor were limited. Speed was a defining feature of pre-modern death management. Delays created problems. They occupied space. They risked complaints. City regulations often specified how quickly burial must occur. These rules were especially strict during warm seasons. Night burials were sometimes restricted. Daytime movement allowed oversight. The process moved quickly, not out of reverence, but necessity. Transporting the body was a visible part of urban life. Bodies were carried by hand, on wooden biers, or in simple carts. The method depended on distance and status. Routes passed through active streets. There was no expectation of privacy. Processions varied in size. Some were small and quiet. Others included clergy or guild members. Transport was functional. The goal was arrival, not display. Early urban burials often occurred within city boundaries. Churchyards were common burial sites. They were centrally located and heavily used. Space was limited. Graves were reused. Older remains were sometimes displaced to make room for new burials. Bones were moved to charnel houses or stacked along walls. This was not considered unusual. Burial space was treated as a managed resource. As cities grew, burial increasingly moved outward. New cemeteries were established beyond city walls. This reduced crowding and complaints. Transport distances increased. This required more coordination and labor. Burial outside the city also reduced health concerns, though these were not always well understood. By the 18th and 19th centuries, this practice became more common. Death generated paperwork. Religious institutions recorded burials. Municipal authorities tracked fees and permissions. Records included names, dates, and locations. Accuracy varied. Fees were charged for burial space, transport, and labor. Costs differed by status and location. Failure to pay could delay burial or limit options. Death was both a physical and administrative event. A typical sequence followed a predictable pattern. Death occurred in the home. Immediate care was provided by family. Authorities were notified. Arrangements were made. The body was prepared quickly. Transport was organized. Burial occurred within a short time frame. Records were updated. Life in the surrounding household resumed. This cycle repeated daily across the city. Wealth affected options. Affluent households could afford coffins, clergy, and larger processions. Poorer residents relied on basic services. Some cities provided burial for the indigent. Others relied on charity. Cultural and religious differences shaped details. The structure remained similar. During epidemics or disasters, systems strained. Deaths increased rapidly. Burial capacity was overwhelmed. Temporary burial grounds were established. Processes were simplified. Individual rights were reduced or eliminated. Speed became the priority. These moments revealed the underlying system. Several changes reshaped death management. Urban populations grew. Space became scarcer. Medical knowledge expanded. Public health concerns increased. Dedicated professions emerged. Funeral homes developed. Infrastructure replaced custom. Services replaced shared labor. Before this transition, cities managed the dead through routine, distributed systems. They were imperfect, they were constrained, but they functioned. For centuries, death was handled not by specialists, but by cities adapting to necessity.